Hi, I'm Thaddeus Hicks with Black Fox Knife Works. Today we'll be going over how to assemble your Black Fox grinder. So let's go ahead and dig into it. So the tools you'll need to set up your Black Fox 1 grinder are a couple Allens. You'll need an 1/8 inch Allen, a 7/32 Allen, some 3/4 inch wrenches or socket, a 5/16 socket or wrench, and a 1/4 inch wrench or socket. Then I also recommend using a towel. So we'll lay the towel down, put the grinder on it because we'll be moving it around. You don't want to scratch it up on your workbench. So what you should receive with the grinder is our basic bolt kit, and in here you'll have your manual as well as any other information that came with the motor or the VFD. You'll also have your tracking bolts and bushing, your motor wire ties, your motor mounting bolts, and right here this is the shelf for your platen. So if you ever glass your platen, you'll want to put this on with the glass. You don't need to use it right away unless you plan on glassing your platen right away. You will also receive 2 1/2 inch bolts and washers. These are your platen bolts. You'll receive a motor from Baldor. You'll need to make sure that you have the 5/8 inch key. Sometimes these can come off in the boxes, so just make sure you have that. And then the motor, we pre-wire everything here. So all these wires should be tied to the appropriate locations, but we'll go over that once we get into the wiring portion of this. 3 sets of wires are going to be tied together. That's always going to be standard. In the motor, you should have a motor grip strain relief here. Should also come with a drive wheel and a tracking wheel. The grinder base, your platen, your 17-inch tooling arm for your platen, your 20-inch tooling arm for your work rest. And we'll go up how to set these up here in a little bit. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install the motor onto the grinder. And so I've got the towel laid out, and then I've tipped the grinder back onto its dry plate. So that's going to help us maneuver the motor into place. I've removed the little 5/8 inch key or 5/8 shaft key over to the dry wheel, so I know I don't forget it during that step. And then I've gotten out my countersunk dry bolts and then my 7/32 Allen key. So let's go ahead and mount the motor up. So I'm just going to get it here through, and you'll see that this has a little lip on it. So you want to make sure that lip is up on the dry plate, and then we'll kind of move this around to where we can get one hole and then rotate it around till we get all the holes. One thing to know is this piece is going to go straight out the back, so we'll need to rotate this a little bit. And then the first hole that I look for is on the bottom right here. So I'll go ahead and insert a bolt. Get it started. We're not going to get it tight all the way. Since the motor does have a little bit of it's not completely flat because we're kind of rotating it around. We might have a little bit of towel between it, but what we want to do is make sure that that bolt is not going in at an odd angle and stripping out the internal threads. So there it goes, nice and easy. Shouldn't be hard at all. So we're going to get it about that tight. By using this bolt, I'm going to rotate up on the motor and install the bolt on the other side. Just going to get hand tight, and again it should go in fairly easy. Make sure you're not cross threading. And then from there your other bolts should be lined up perfectly. Now that we've got the bolts snug, we're going to tighten in a cross pattern. So starting at the top bolts, we'll tighten that one. Going down to this bottom bolt, we'll tighten that one. Over here, tighten that one, and then tighten this one. These are 3/8 inch bolts, so you could look up the torque specs for them if you want to. But I just think a nice, good snug, and then as much as you can without putting too much stress into the head of the bolts to where you're stripping it out is a good rule of thumb if you don't have a torque wrench. Okay, so let's move on to the next step. All right, so the next step is to wire the motor into the motor cable. So this right here is going to be our motor cable, and we'll feed it through the strain relief, and then we'll wire these wires together. But before we do that, I wanted to go over the VFD that is in the base. So this is the KB Electronics KBVF-26D. It has an input of 115 and 230 volts on a 50-60 hertz. And you can kind of see the different max amperage and rated phases. So this motor is a 5.5 amp. This is rated for 5.5 amps. So you're going to get the full 2 horsepower out of this, no matter if you wire it 115 or 220, 230, whatever you want to wire it at. They have a good manual set. We include the manual with them. So if you want to do anything different with it, they include these little trim pots. We just keep them as standard, default. But you can read into what those do. They can brake faster. They can help you compensate with your motors and stuff like that. This pin here, these 3 pins are going to be your potentiometer pins. This one right here is your forward, stop, reverse. So what we do is we take off this little red clip. We add the 3-pin connector that comes with the VFD, and we wire that into the switch. So if you're ever having problems, sometimes the problem is that this little red pin jumper between the 2 pins right here has come off, or one of these. It's got a little status light to where you'll be able to check the status and the power to do some little bit of troubleshooting if you ever have a problem with that. So the really cool thing about these VFDs is that they can be wired for 230 or 115. And really it's as simple as moving this jumper from here to here, and then wiring in your new power cord into the L1 and L2 and through the power switch. So a really great unit, a lot of versatility. So if your grinder does come with 115, you want to upgrade it to 230. So 230 is only going to provide less amperage, which means that you'll pay a lower power bill than if you're running 115. But the power should be the same coming through the grinder. So the grinder, what this does is you put 115 in here, it'll step it up to 220 out to the grinder, out to the motor of the grinder. So it's always going to be 220 at your motor, and that's important for when you wire it up. You're going to wire it at the low side, which is a 220, 230 wiring schematic, and not the high side, which is 460. But this will convert anything you need from your motor out to your power cable. So it's doing all that conversion in here, which is a great little VFD. So let's go ahead and get started and wire up our motor. So what we're going to do is just feed these wires through. And then just get this hand tight. After you get done wiring it, you'll just come back in with a wrench and tighten this down. So the first thing that I like to do is I like to ground it. So we'll take the green with the terminal, and you should have a green little screw. It'll either be screwed into the grinder already, or somewhere in your kit, most likely screwed into the motor. So you'll just need to unscrew that, and then you can screw in your terminal. There's 2 places you can do it. You can do it over here on this side or over here on this side. I prefer to do it over here, that way the wire doesn't have to bend as much. And to do this, I'm just using this 5/16 socket. All right, so next up, we're going to wire these leads into these leads on the motor. And like I said, we're going to do the low voltage diagram. So what this means is 5, 6, and 4 are all going to be tied together. And then a 9 and 3 are going to be tied together. 8 and 2 are going to be tied together. And 7 and 1 are going to be tied together. And those are going to go tied with our lines. So black goes with 7 and 1. White goes with 2 and 8. And then this pink or red goes with 9 and 3. So on these wires inside the motor, you will see, it's very hard to see, but they'll have numbers on them. So this one is number 4, this one is number 5, and then this one is number 6. So those are all tied together with this wire tie. So we build these grinders up here at Black Fox. We test them and everything before we ship them out. So these leads should be somewhat tied together, if not already. They could have come loose in shipping, or when we're pulling them off, sometimes they do pull apart. But it should be wired to the low voltage as standard. So let's go ahead and tie these up. So the one I'm looking for black is 1 and 7. Just because I've done this enough, I know that 1 and 7 is this blue and pink wire coming out of the ball door motor. And that is current as of March 2022. So let's go ahead and tie that with our black. So you're just going to twist all these leads together. And then you'll take one of the wire ties from your kit and screw that onto your wires. And you should feel it grab and then get tighter as you go. And that's a nice good connection right there. So next up, we're going to do whites, and we're going to look for 8 and 2. So on here you can clearly see the 8. It's really nicely marked on the red, and then the 2 is on this white. So go ahead, we're going to do the same thing. Connect these wires together. And then lastly on 9 and 3 with the pink or red, however you see it. Okay, so that is all the wiring you need to do. We'll just shove these back into the motor box, make sure they're all down, and then we'll put the motor cover back on top. So for this, you'll need a 1/4 inch socket or a wrench. I prefer to use these on the long sockets with the screwdriver. This makes it a bit easier reaching down into things. You could use a flathead. I found that they usually slip off, and sometimes I mark things when I do that, and I just like the positive engagement of a hex head. All right, so we'll get those all tightened down, and we'll move on to the next step. All right, so the next step in building up your grinder is we're going to add the drive wheel. Since we got done with the motor, we'll do the drive wheel. That'll be all taken care of. So here's our drive wheel. It has you need a 1/8 inch Allen to move the set screw in there. So make sure that this set screw is backed off, so it's clearing the passage in there. There's nothing blocking it. We'll go ahead and add our key to the motor, and then we will put on the motor set screw with the key. All right, so the next step is to make sure that the motor, this edge of the motor is 3/8 inch away from the drive plate, That'll give you a good point of where the belt wants to go. So right there is 3/8 from the dry plates. We'll go ahead and tighten down our set screw in there. So now it is set in place and won't move on you. All right, on to the next step. Next step of assembling the grinder is to add the tracking wheel. So here's our tracking wheel, and it has bearings, and inside of there you'll see that it's got a spacer. So this will help the bearings stay apart. And when you start to screw in that bolt, it's not going to try to collapse the bearings together and cause some unwanted heat, as well as just ruin the bearings pretty much. They need to run as parallel as possible. So you can kind of see it's off center, but all you do is you just take your bolt, feed it through, and that'll get you where you need to be. So the hex head, you don't need a washer on this side. You'll just put that flush with the bearing, because this already has like a little bit of a seat on it, and so that can just go on the bearing. It's not going to contact the seal, so that's good. On this side, what we'll need is a machined bushing, and these are included. We'll put this on this side. You can notice that it just contacts the inner race, it doesn't contact the outer race. It also does not contact the seal, and that is important. So I like to put it so the shiny side is out, the flat side is being tightened down to our little tension block. All right, so we get that hand tight, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab my 3/8 socket, and we'll tighten that down. And again, like I said, it's got the anti-crush, so just get it snug up. Doesn't have to be as hard as you can go, and then you want it to be able to free spin like that. All right, we'll go on to the next step. All right, now that we've got our motor, our drive wheel, and our tracking wheel, the next step is to add the platen and the work rest. So taking our platen, it'll be all assembled for us, and the shorter tooling arm, so 17-inch tooling arm, we will feed it through our tooling arm slot, and then we'll just tighten this at any sort of length. Doesn't have to be anything particular. Next up, we'll grab our 1/2-inch bolts. I like to start with the first screw up here on this side and get this tightened down to the platen. We use our 1/2-inch, or sorry, our 3/4 socket again, and get those tightened down. Next thing you're going to want to check is make sure that these wheels are spinning. So this top wheel is a little tight. Just make sure you check that before you start going. This bottom wheel is pretty good. I would call that good. It gives a little bit of spin, but you can see this top one doesn't at all. So to correct that, what we're doing is we're going to loosen up this bolt a little bit and make sure that it does spin, and then we'll jam this nut to here to fix it all in place. So these wheels do not come with spacers between them, so what you're doing is you're pulling the races together, and that's what's causing this, and it's going to overheat very quickly, especially on the 2-inch wheel since it's spinning a lot faster than everything else. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen that up. You can see it spins a lot better now. It's got a little bit of side-to-side movement, so I am going to tighten that back down just a little bit. It's a little bit of a fine-tuning process, but once you understand what you're doing, it can really help you preserve the life of these wheels. So there we go. We got a little bit of spin out of it. Doesn't stop right away. And then there's no side-to-side movement. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that that is jammed up against there. Now this whole assembly should not move at all. I'm just going to make sure that this one is jammed as well. Make sure nothing came loose in shipping. Looks good. The platen is aligned here. And then we will move on to our work rest. All right, so to assemble the work rest, this is how it's going to come in the package. We've got these little spacers here, a bottom plates, and then our top plates. So what we need to do is make sure that we get these spacers assembled to the tracking or the tooling arm. And what this is going to do is it's going to give enough space to where when you flip the grinder into a horizontal position, this will space it up to where it wants to be aligned with the platen. If you weren't using too much horizontal grinding and you wanted to make sure you used up the most amount of space here and you want to remove these spacers, that is completely fine. But just for the complete setup, these spacers help you get that to where it's aligned, and then you don't have to worry about flipping it and adding spacers. At some point, if you want to add an adjustable work rest that'll do like everything that you need without having spacers, that is also an option, upgradable in the future. So let's go ahead. First, I like to take off this bottom plate. So we need to get to the larger, I believe these are 5/16 or 3/8 bolts. 3/8 is the correct answer. Okay, so next up, I'm going to insert the tooling arm into the tooling arm slot, and then I'm just going to tighten it a little bit here. I'm going to grab this assembly with the spacers and the bolts so I can get to the bolts, and you just have to remember which side it came off. So we want to put our platen on, our work rest on like this. So that means that these bolts need to come off and on like this. This is not, it is directional, which means that it's going to matter which way you put this on. We'll grab our Allen key. In this case, it's a 7/32 Allen key. Screw in these bolts. Okay, so right now we've got a little bit of play in it. It's exactly what I want. I like to make sure that this is lined up with your platen. So come up to your platen, make sure it's squared up, you don't have a gap on either side, and then go ahead and tighten these bolts down. That's going to make sure everything is aligned properly. All right, then we'll just pull this off a little bit and we'll add our top plate. Top plate should sit on there very nicely, and then we'll use our 1/8 inch Allen to add back in these button head screws. And again, you're just going to want to get them not tight all the way, but just started at every single point. The last final step will be squaring it up, much like we did with the bottom plate. Okay. Next up, we're going to make sure that this is square also with your platen, and we'll go ahead and tighten down these 4 screws. That way you have a nice large work area with minimal screw interference into it. All right, and then the next step will be making sure that your grinder runs as it should. So we'll go over that next. All right, so the last step is to make sure your grinder is tracking properly. To do that, I just use a ceramic 120 belts. I don't like to use the heaviest belts because the heavier belts have bigger backings and thicker material grits on them. Using a lighter belts will give you a bit better information on tracking, because sometimes the cut seams can be off a little bit. You can see on this one, the top edge is a little bit more separated than the bottom edge. So you just need to be aware of that. That can throw your tracking off, because what it's doing is that this edge has to run longer than this edge. So there's a slight imbalance in that, and any sort of imbalance, any sort of misalignment can throw your tracking off by quite a bit. So let's go ahead and throw this belt on there. Even though it's not a perfect belt, we'll see how it runs. Okay, so first thing is you want to make sure that you pull your work rest off of your platen. That way you're not running your grit into your platen and ruining your work rest right away. So first off, you're going to put the belt on all the wheels. You can see that the platen, it's really slack, no tension in it. So what we need to do is take our platen, pull it out. What I like to do at least is pull it out to where you have a bit of tension, remove the belt a little bit, pull it slightly more, and then lock it down. And then that should give us a good amount of tension. So you want to make sure that you're pressing up on this is pushing up. And then you're going to want to take your hand and just kind of get a feel of how the belt's going to run. So you can kind of see that over here we've got a little bit of belt running off. So we're just going to adjust this down. And that is going to correct that. So when we turn the grinder on, this is going to be much quicker. Adjustments are going to go much faster, but first we just want to make sure that the belt is running somewhat smooth and centerline on the grinder. One thing to note is once you find your place or where you like your tension, this is a 40-pound spring, so it's always going to put out 40 pounds of pressure no matter where you are in this travel. So I like to get it about halfway. That way I know it's got tension, it's not trying to bottom out. And then I would mark this arm with a Sharpie if I'm just using this for the platen. So whenever I take this off, put an attachment, I know exactly where I want this tooling arm to sit when I put it back in. Okay, next up is we'll power up the grinder. So something to know on powering up the grinder is that the KBVF has a high starting power, so it needs a lot of torque to get this motor going. So if you're running it on a GFCI, it's going to pop the GFCI and it's not going to work. So you'll need a standard 120 or 220 outlet without any sort of protection on it, and then make sure that your circuit is rated for that as well. I think here at the shop I'm running a 25-30 amp circuit, which is what you want for a 115, and then on a 220-230 circuit, I think it's a 15 amp is what they want there. It's all in the manual though. All right, let's go ahead and pull our power cord. I'm gonna plug it in. First off, I want to make sure it's off. I want to make sure this is in stop, and then this is at 0. We're going to plug it in, and then we're going to hit on. You should hear a little bit of a whine, and that's the VFD coming online, making sure that everything's good to go. Next up, we are going to switch it into forward, and then we will turn our potentiometer slowly. And then there is the grinder running. So we can see that it's running about down the center of the platen. We're just going to move it over slightly. And we can see it's running down the center of the platen, the wheels, and both wheels. We're going to go ahead and turn up the speed. Everything's looking good. It's running really well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn down the speed. I like to go about a quarter of the way down. We're going to switch it into stop mode, and then we are going to switch it into reverse. So something important to know about reverse, we include it on all our grinders, but your tracking is all going to be driven off your drive wheel. You can't adjust it at any point. Because the last wheel it sees is the drive wheel, and that's going to set your tracking. So it could shim one way to the other. You could take a long time to try to get that out, but I just recommend, what we try to do here is get it about 1/8 of an inch within its boundary, and then we call that good. So if you are working with like a jig to where you're sharpening like a bowl gouge or something, and you're using your jig on here and you're sharpening something, the belt is spinning this way, so if it wants to kick something, it wants to go up rather than down into your jig and possibly flying out. So that's the only reason why we include reverse. It's really easy to include, but the tracking is not perfect since it's all running off the drive wheel, and the drive wheel is stationary. So just to check reverse, if you are going to use it, I turn this down to 1/4, and then let's flip it in reverse. So you can see automatically it wants to jump to the other side. Moving this down and up isn't going to do anything because it's all driven off the drive wheel. You could adjust that drive wheel to get it to where you want it. There's other little adjustments you can do, flipping these wheels left and right. Sometimes that can help because these wheels are rubber. They do like to grip the belts. So even like a slight angle can really affect how this belt runs in reverse. So there's a lot of little fine tuning you can do to figure out how to get that running perfectly in reverse. If you're not going to use reverse or find that you don't really want to use reverse, I wouldn't worry about it. Even belts, like we said that this belt isn't perfect, and I think that's why it kicked over so much. So just play around with it if you do want to work in reverse. It is a tough thing to solve out though, I will tell you that. So we're going to go ahead and stop it. We're going to turn it off. And that is how you set up your Black Fox machine. So next up, we'll be going over some tips and tricks on things to notice with the Black Fox machine. And we'll review that here in a second. All right, next are going to be some operating tips for the Black Fox machine. So all these adjustments are easy to make, just screw them in and out. If you want to flip the machine into horizontal, you remove your tooling arm or your work rest, set that off to the side for now. And then it's going to be much easier once the grinder is bolted down. You could clamp it down. It'll be much easier since I've been doing this for quite a while. I know how to tilt these machines over. So what you're going to do is you're going to pull up on this while slightly pushing on this. It's really going to give you a nice lever arm because this point from the pivot is much further than this point here. And what you really need to do is get out of the detent, and then after that you're able to rotate the machine over, and then you'll just let it fall into place. And then pull up on it so you go back into the detent. So now the machine is going to be stable in this position. We'll go ahead and add our work rest. And I'm going to get the belt running back down. Turn it on very slowly, going into forward. Get the belt where we want it. I'm going to hit stop real quick. You'll notice that when you push in the work rest, it's not going to line up. That's because this work rest is fixed in a location, and you can rotate your platen any way you want. So to do that, you're just going to loosen this up right here, pull your platen in alignment with your work rest, and then go ahead and tighten this down. You'll notice that there is another 1/2 inch hole right here. You could remove or add a second handle for your work rest. So if you're always in this position and you're always moving your work rest, you can add a little handle here, and then you'll be able to work with your work rest on this side of it rather than having to reach under the machine. All right, some important things to note about using the grinder in the horizontal position. So this one, you can use it to do your profiling work. You can use it to do some edge work here. Make sure this is all 90 degrees. You can use it to, do anything you need. You can even use the slacks on this side and this side. So this is really meant for light, nice, easy profiling work to where you're not pressing down too hard. This machine is primarily made for knife making. We understand that there's a lot of people that use it for different things. So we're continually trying to improve it. And then one thing you're going to want to know is that I get a lot of comments is, yeah, if I push down on this end, it's going to rotate the grinder. What's happening is you have a big lever arm again. So this is a small lever arm. So if we put it here, it's like pushing here, which is still pretty stable. But if you push out here, obviously you're going to be able to rotate your grinder because it's just a large lever arm. So one way you could get around that is if you have the larger arm, so we have these 1/2 inch arms, we've included a little 1/4 inch hole right here, and then it has a corresponding hole in the back if you have the latest Black Fox 1 grinder setup. Some of the arms are thinner arms on the previous machines that look like this. We can send you a new arm if you want to the thicker arm with the 1/4 inch hole in it. And so what we're doing is we're adding a little plunger into it. So this will plunge in, lock the arm in place, and then if you wanted to rotate it, you'd have to pull this out and then you'd be able to move it. These plungers you can buy off McMaster-Carr. This one is a JW Winco. Is what we're using. The plungers off of McMaster-Carr. I think the plunger portion of it is slightly longer and bigger, so it might give you more holding power. You would have to drill out this hole slightly and then come back in with like Rust-Oleum to cover that hole up so it doesn't rust. But then you'd be able to add a little plunger in there too. And I think they have one that like pulls out, you rotate it, and then it stops. And so the plunger can be engaged or not engaged without having to hold it. So that will help hold the grinder in place, either in the vertical or horizontal position, if you are having that issue where you're really pushing down on this end for some reason when you're grinding in the horizontal position. The vertical position is much stabler. That's because this edge is longer, and in the horizontal position, this edge is not quite as long, just to make it easier to move the grinder around. All right, that is it for the Black Fox 1. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email us at info@blackfoxknifeworks.com, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. All right, thank you.